Thank you for coming to my 20 minutes. You can't hear me? Okay. Slightly? I'll promise to be louder. How about is that better? Perfect. Thank you for coming to my session. My name is Jeremy Young, and I'll explain this as briefly as I can. I work for a company called the corporate overlords. Were a little too involved, I think, in our presentation, so instead of advertise for them, I opt instead to work here. Because I think it helps give a little bit of background for the tool and kind of the purpose of what I'll be talking about, I'll briefly describe me. I went to school to be a meteorologist. Until I met my wife, I thought for sure I'd be forecasting the weather someplace, maybe working for the National Weather Service, and I did my master's program on modeling tropical weather systems. Before that time, I had no idea what Linux was, and have since converted into a total Linux nerd. I pretty much hate everything Microsoft, and got my first job right out of school and I worked there for a few years, got a lot of good experience, because you'd be surprised just how painful Homeland Security, FBI, and some of the other three-letter agencies can make things. If those of you don't know, that's a really horrible experience, and I never recommend it to anybody. I helped them move some of their applications to the cloud. That's where I got some of my cloud experience and some of my exposure to Docker. And that kind of DevOps role, before they started to make it a real hot buzzword, everybody put on a resume, got me a lot of valuable expertise that I brought with me to Asurion, and helped them in a lot of their operations tasks until recently joining the security group there. But I've always kind of had this interest in pen testing and security based on some of my experiences at the government, and that's really gotten me interested in some of the Security Mavens program Mark spoke about, and more importantly, how I can make some use of some of these DevOps and automation skills to attack the things that we're trying to move to the cloud. So in case that image is not super visible, there's a really nice looking open source project out there called PACU. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right. The guy markets this as kind of the Metasploit framework, but for Amazon. And if you want to know what an attacker is trying to do to your cloud, this is probably a good place to look. Is this everything an attacker could do? Probably not, but if you can have somebody do some really interesting things to you and not go detected, a lot like Mr. Kim was talking about earlier today, this is a good place to see what they might be trying to do so you could bolster up your defenses. Has anyone in the audience used this by chance? Or do you have other tools or maybe in this space? Have you had good experiences with them? No, that's okay, that's fine. For those of you who haven't used something like this, imagine what kind of valuable information I could get if I could take one of your RDS snapshots that's probably not encrypted, and read all of your customers' data. Maybe I've compromised a web app that you didn't know existed, and then it has an overly permissive IAM policy. And it allows me to do lots of these things that are listed up here. I can look for RDS snapshots, mount them to my instance that I now control, and read all of your database without actually compromising your database. What about injecting code into running instances via the SSM agent that people install? That's one of my favorite things to do, is run arbitrary code as root on your box because you gave me the permissions to do it. I don't even have to have credentials anymore. What about having CloudWatch events trigger a Lambda that I've added that will add backdoor IAM access keys to a user account that exists? That's now permanently there. You can't, unless you know I've done that, you can't take it away. Lots of other things. This is intended to be a brief overview of what this tool does, and I'm sure there's plenty more that creative people in the audience can do that we haven't even talked about. But it's a wealth of information that's out there in the cloud just by being able to access the API. So compromise one thing and then pivot from there. The cloud can be a really fun place. So how do you test and monitor for things like that? I mean, you could buy something really expensive. I mean, we all have our favorite vendor that may or may not be here. Or they may have a tool that kind of sounds like Kerplunk that's probably the go-to for lots of folks here. I mean, come on, we all know who I'm talking about. There are cloud services in this space. A lot of the cloud providers now have tools like this. Amazon Guard Duty is the one I'm probably most familiar with, just because we happen to have a large footprint in Amazon. But there are others, of course. Azure has theirs called Security Center. GCP, I'm sure, has one. You know, all the other smaller vendors, I'm sure they'll eventually build something as they catch up. Has anybody in the audience made use of one of these tools? And do you like it? If so, why? I'm just more probing here than anything. Come on, don't all speak up at once. It's okay. The problem with tools like this, though, is that they tend to make use of their own data as the input to their, most likely, some kind of neural network or machine learning model that will highlight anomalies. And if you don't use something like in GuardDuty's case, Route 53, a third of the data that it's ingesting to identify potential risks or compromises is pretty much gone. They have no good answer for something like DNS over HTTPS, you know, and if you're in a super compliant environment or you just don't want your data exfiltration to be detected and you're using DNS over HTTPS to do it, GuardDuty's never gonna pick that up. What if I whitelist my IP on GuardDuty because of that overly permissive IAM role that I've taken advantage of? These aren't quite there, and what we really need is something like a static analysis tool. As far left in the pipeline to, you know, maybe introduce my one and only buzzword. We want to get as far left in the pipeline as we can, and knowing that there's a lot of good open source out there, I wanted to try and take advantage of some of the good open source, make use of the best features of what we could, and maybe write some glue, and we've done that at the place that I happen to work for, which, as a reminder, so if you're a CloudFormation person, CFN NAG is something that, written by a company that, at least at the time I knew of them, called Stelligent. They were a contractor or a consultant company. I think Amazon may have actually bought them. But they wrote in Ruby a tool called CFN NAG that's pretty popular, and if you write a CloudFormation template, it can tell you about vulnerabilities that you may be introducing in your infrastructure, open security groups. I don't know if it's very feature-rich, but it's at least there and a good start at the types of things that you could be doing. There are a lot for Terraform, some of which are better than others, but the problem with tools like Terrascan, Terraform Validate, TFLint is that they either kind of stink totally, like they don't really do much of anything, or they're abandoned, or they, you know, they parse just JSON and not necessarily the HCL that you have. If you're writing in Terraform and you need the tool to check for, you know, potential issues, these are probably capable, but they're not exactly what we were looking for. I learned of one while doing some research for the presentation called Scout Suite. Has anybody heard of that one? Do some research. I'll be interested to hear if you all find good things about it, but it's at least multi-cloud. Having a tool that could run in an unattended mode in a CI/CD pipeline and tell you about vulnerabilities in your infrastructure is probably a good thing. I don't have much experience with this one. It could be great. Because I was more looking for that static analysis piece that could run in the developers on the developer's laptop, and I didn't want to have to give access keys to every one of our developers for the infrastructure. So there are probably others, but the problem with tools that either don't hit the bar quite yet or are missing maybe some features is that our devs generally just don't want to use them. Our idea, though, is a tool that in my time at a back office or a slower moving part of our company, it's called Infraspec. I came from the Linux world where, you know, the first tools I was using when I moved to the cloud with that three-letter agency I mentioned, was server spec. So I had some experience with these Ruby-based DSLs that were pretty easy to read and write. The problem then was I didn't have a team that was really ready to jump on the coding bandwagon yet. Now that we do, we wanted to have a tool that worked just like that in a Python that was approachable for QA folks who don't really write much code, at least at our place, and other more inexperienced developers. We could have interns come in and start working on this. If it's easy to read, easy to write, we could get test coverage for a lot of things right out of the gate and not really have a lot of extra effort or cost involved. The goal, of course, is empowering everyone to participate and hopefully make this a tool we can use to identify security issues by security folks. The important thing is that this is not legacy Python. We specifically wrote this tool for Python 3.7 and greater because of some of the new features that are out. F-strings in particular, some of the concurrency features that are involved with async and await. We can make this really fast by using modern Python. So as much as the security community tends to cling to the old school legacy Python, sorry, we will not support that, at least at the company where I work, which, as a reminder, the others who are maybe familiar with a Fluent API design, that would be, if you're familiar with like daisy chaining functions, it's very popular in the JavaScript world, probably .NET too. It wasn't, at least in my experience, very popular in Python, but we decided to make that the case here for this tool to make it easier to read and write for folks. It's easier to document too, because if you have verbs that are human readable, that can be called on just about any object that we have in memory, it's easy to understand what's happening. And now, all of our teams are really ready to use something like this. That's the best part about it to me, is we have teams working on getting test coverage for their infrastructure. Some of our teams that were very, very insecure, would have failed any external pen test that was ever thrown at them, are now starting to fix some of the big issues. And as we continue to get more test coverage over the resources we're using, we'll be able to fix more issues we don't even know exist yet. So I knew that I was going to be through this a little quicker than I had expected. I didn't need the full 20 minutes, but I'm happy to answer questions. I cannot open source this yet because we have to have the approval from that long, annoying sound company. I won't play the beep again. While we go through that process and beef up our coverage of resources in the cloud, for now, I can at least show you what the docs might look like. So can everybody in the back kind of read what that says? Is that a little too small? Seems like it, yeah.
Quick question.
Sure.
So is this actually based on RSpec, or is it like a Python rewrite of it?
This is totally Python. It's inspired by RSpec or AWS spec, some of those tools in that space, but it is not at all based. It's not at all derived from them. Okay. Just inspired because they've got really great tools in the Ruby field for doing things like this, and not really in Python. An example, that I have up on the screen here would be an example test that we could have run by the Python unit test framework. The Fluent API is really what I wanted to demonstrate here, because if anything, I'd love it if I inspired some of you all to go back to your respective workplaces and write something similar. When we get to the point where we can open source something like this, then if we build a community, I'm really happy about that. But until that point, something like this is easy for the interns that we just hired at our company to start really helping bolster our test coverage. That's the biggest thing we wanted to work on here. And we're testing for things like, this is a tool, as I mentioned early on, intended for DevOps, QA, and security. So some of the features here to make sure that we're spread across multiple availability zones, that we're not opening ingress to 0000, that our EBS volumes are all perfectly encrypted. Some of these tests are going to validate the Terraform that we're writing, so we're going to parse the HCL and look at that to see whether or not things are secure and deemed appropriate. Other things are going to test existing resources to see if SSM parameters are encrypted. We can do either, so that this could be a post-creation tool or pre-creation, and hopefully run in both places. Given that, I am happy to take any questions, but hoping that getting through this pretty quickly will help us, get back on track in case we're behind. I don't know.
What company did you say you were from?
Oh yeah. For those that didn't know, oh. Nice. It is up there. So, question.
So what was the major shortcomings you really found, like you were trying to address the most? Like, what was the major thing, like, crap, I'm not doing that?
Mostly language choice. We wanted a tool that people could have full functionality of a real programming language and not a DSL that hides a lot of things from you. And the language that most of our DevOps folks were comfortable with was Python. That's the reason for the rewrite. I was happy to learn something new, but we needed it to be approachable for as large an audience as possible. And at that beep place, that happens to be Python.
So the tool, InfraSpec, is the tool you will open source as soon as you get approval from.
Exactly.
But it's most the framework for writing a bunch of tests,
Yes.
Are you planning to also just kind of release a suite of standard types of checks along with that, that you know, just out of the box, you've got, you get the ground running then?
I think that's an awesome idea. I hadn't thought of that. It was, because this is intended to be more of a library than the actual enforcement tool. That policy would be more of one of those things I would be expecting the teams to decide for themselves. But it is possible for us to have like out of the gate tests, or at least examples people could derive their tests from. There's no other yes, ma'am. Yeah, ideally, you know, if everything goes to plan, 6 months maybe. I don't know. Yeah, coming from the feds, that didn't happen very much there, so I don't know how long that takes at my current employer. Sir.
I walked in late, but how would you differentiate this from the capabilities of like cloud custodian?
They're very similar in space. I would say Cloud Custodian would run kind of all times. You could have that run in a pipeline like this. This is more of, I want to write all of the tests myself and be a little more lower level than a Cloud Custodian, which would give you the YAML description for what you're trying to test for. Mm-hmm.